On April 13th, 2023, Kenyan police responded to reports of people starving in the woods near a small town nestled in the bend of the Ganala River named Shakula. Well, this came as quite a shock to say the least, as authorities knew the place to be full of strong, hard-working people. No one should be starving over there. Quickly, police mounted a column of trucks and ambulances, rushing west over C-103, the 40 or so miles from Malindi to Shakola village. Eventually, paved roads yielded to dusty red sand trails as the column moved further into the bush. And as the forest around them began to thicken, officers noticed something strange. Some pointing out lean human forms disappearing into the bush, some casually, and others running as if for their lives. The people appeared to be fleeing. Well, when the police column finally stopped near the town center, dozens of concerned citizens began to crowd around the various trucks and vans, all citizens speaking at once. Quickly, police quieted the crowd, finding that they were simply glad to see them, unlike the strange figures they had passed in the woods. Well, relieved by the townsfolk's warm reception, police then hopped out of their vehicles and began interviewing citizens, and the story these people told them would go on to shock the world.
Several people have died of starvation and possibly many more from what police say was a radicalized Christian pastor in Kenya leading them in a fasting ritual. At least 4 were found in an emaciated state and died while being rushed to the hospital in a police rescue operation on a house in the county of Kilifi. They were among about 15 people found in the house fasting. Most are now in stable condition, but police are investigating reports that there may be as many as 30 more buried in a local forest.
After the survivors had been evacuated and the 4 bodies accounted for, police began questioning a well-known cult leader and televangelist residing in the area, a Mr. Paul Mackenzie Nthenge. After all, these people were found on and near his sprawling farmstead, which seems a lot more than mere coincidence. But despite this damning and immutable fact, Nthenge acted cagey and befuddled. When asked about the people in the woods, Nthenge simply shrugged and pretended to be ignorant of the entire situation, saying he had no idea what they were talking about. After all, he had closed his church in 2019 after a crippling wave of lawsuits leveled against him by enemies. He went on to say he was but a simple farmer now, nothing more. But police weren't buying his story. They simply rolled their eyes and quickly dispatched teams to a local wooded area on the cult leader's compound. For by now, police had received news that at least dozens of more people were starving in those same woods, and worse yet, they had received the location of a mass grave, a pit dug for those of Nthenge's followers that had already succumbed. And unfortunately, these were but the latest in a string of victims that I've traced back at least to the year 2017, though I have little doubt that the pattern extends long before even then. Now here's the part of the video where most folks would show you Nthenge as a child, with positive music and a narrative full of what might have been had he not suffered this or that misfortune. But why? Why would I waste my time or your time by humanizing this guy? No, I mean really, I'm asking. Do we just do that sort of thing to remind us that monsters were once men? Or do we do it with a psycho checklist in mind, ticking boxes each time the man suffers a misfortune or a triumph? No, either way, I don't want to do that. No, you don't need to know his birthday or see his photo from 9th grade to know what kind of man he is. All you really need to know is that he started off as a shady televangelist and used the power and influence he gained to amass followers. And then after gaining a large following, he began a new ministry, calling his church the Good News International Church, located in Malindi, Kenya. And then, over time, he began to shift his message, eventually preaching withdrawal from the world. And from what I could gather, Nthenge fancied himself a prophet, claiming as they all do that the end is near and that he alone knew shortcuts to salvation. Oh yeah, and apparently this is the point where I'm supposed to go into his teachings, right? Thereby spreading his weird philosophy? Nah, again, why would I give a cult leader a platform to preach? No, we're not diving into Charles Manson here. All you really need to know is that the man was not very original, his being just another variety of Christian death cult we've seen a million times over. I mean, you know the ones, those for whom the end is always near. You know, the type that reads the book of Revelation a little too frequently. It's like, guys, the Bible has other books in it. No, we'll begin with the first documented case of abuse and brainwashing I could find from the man. Though I have little doubt that the man had begun his indoctrination long before this. After all, by this point, bro has a few dozen lieutenants who are also out there brainwashing people. Not only that, but he was also running a weekly TV show where he begged his thousands of followers for money and told them that the world was going to end. Nice guy, allegedly. Well, apparently by 2017, Paul Nthenge and his cult were well and truly established in the city of Malindi, with his TV spots and local sermons reaching literally tens of thousands of urban residents, as well as many others in the bush and countryside. And just like any good televangelist, Nthenge then began to beg for money and donations, be they in the form of cash or in the form of free labor. He wasn't too picky. After all, a devoted follower was just as good, if not better, than money. And speaking of his army of devoted followers, it was around this time that he seemed to have weaponized them. Nthenge reportedly telling his followers that he had begun to receive visions from Jesus, and that his Sky Father had instructed everyone to quit their jobs and drop out of school in order to devote themselves to Nthenge's teachings totally. Now I'd like to give a special thanks to Abu Africa for having this story on hand. September 29th, 2017, authorities in the city of Malindi raided Nthenge's Good News International Church after receiving reports of child abuse, neglect, and brainwashing. Nthenge was arrested and afterward accused of radicalizing 53 children he had been holding on the church grounds. Well, the man insisted that he had not forced them to be there, but that they had come as disciples of the faith. Just like any good cult leader would. It's not like the guy's just going to be like, "Oh yeah, you caught me, I was trying to create an army of zealots, my bad." No, unfortunately, evil always has an excuse. Always. No, after interviewing the children and their adult handlers, it quickly became clear that Nthenge had been encouraging them to drop out of school and renounce the world in order to join his cult. When police broke into his small, dusty church, they indeed found dozens of children ranging in ages from 10 to 18, all of whom were dirty and malnourished, and most had been in the same clothes for weeks. Well, after the raid, Malindi Police Chief Matawa Machangi had this to say. "In the church, we nabbed 35 children under the age of 10 years, 28 under the age of 16 years, and 13 adults aged 18 to 35 years, said to be undergoing radicalized training against Christian and moral teachings." Going on to say that some of the children interrogated said education is satanic and had left home and school to follow their pastor. In the same article, a local man named Harrison Thoya said that the pastor had brainwashed the children of Malindi. "I've even seen some of the faithful leaving their families to live in the church and failing to provide basic needs." Well, Nthenge and his wife were eventually charged with promoting radicalization, as well as separate charges for failing to provide even the most basic education to their own children. But, despite the charges and notoriety, Nthenge seemed not to have learned a damn thing, and only 2 years later, in a 2019 article, heartbroken parents describe how their children were taken by the cult. The article goes on to describe a household in which all 4 children had become radicalized by Nthenge's teachings. Apparently, it all began when their eldest son began watching Nthenge on TV. It was slow at first, but eventually he fell under the full power of the cult, soon setting his school documents on fire, quitting his job, and leaving for the bush. But this was only the beginning. I'll let the article continue in full. Neda introduced his younger siblings Brian and Ian, who were 13-year-old twins, and the youngest child, Victor, aged 10, to the cult, stated Matambu, the father, who is a blacksmith. The parents also claimed their son was convinced that education was evil and that the world would end in the year 2024. Felix even set ablaze his education certificates, saying Pastor Mackenzie had convinced him that they were all useless, stated his troubled mother. The children's father also told K24 Digital that Felix and his brothers left a note saying that it was unfortunate that they had been denied the opportunity to join Pastor Mackenzie's movement. Mumas East OCPD Awaru Kathani also confirmed that Matumba had reported to him about his missing sons and was working toward tracking the pastor down. After thorough investigations, we discovered that the children joined Pastor Mackenzie of New Hope International Church in Malindi, affirmed Katani. Quoting unnamed sources, K24 Digital confirmed that the man of the cloth has faced at least 12 child radicalization lawsuits and is currently out on a 1 million shilling bond, about 7,500 USD. The Standard reported on April 4, 2019, the cleric was charged in Malindi Township after he was found in possession of cinematographic films intended to incite children against attending school. Further, the court heard that the films incited Christians against Hindus, Buddhists, and Islam. After these children were rescued from Nthenge's cult, more charges were filed, but the rogue pastor remained free. And speaking of, it seems that he was now intent on keeping it that way. And shortly after this, Nthenge closed his Good News International Church, retreating to a sprawling compound near the village of Sokola, a small dusty town nestled in the bend of a river, the outskirts surrounded by red dunes of sand and scrub forest. Here's a first-hand account of the church's exodus from a Nation Africa article titled Unmasking Paul Nthenge, the Preacher Linked to Children's Deaths, by Furia Hussein and Alex Kalama. I'm so sorry for these pronunciations, I really am. Humphrey Inogo, a former member of Pastor Mackenzie's Good News International Church, shed light on what really went on in these sermons. He claimed that Pastor Mackenzie had a hold over his congregants, instructing them to quit their jobs, skip meals, and not seek medical attention when sick. He even told them not to take their children to school, but instead visit the church for life lessons. Mr. Inongo had become suspicious of these instructions and had quit the church, but it was not an easy feat. I was a believer in his sermons for 10 years. When the Malindi church was closed down 3 years ago, the majority of us relocated with Pastor Mackenzie to Musimba and Shikala village. Here we would meet on Saturdays under a tree from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. According to him, all appeared to be well until Pastor Mackenzie started to inform them to quit their jobs, skip meals, and not seek medical attention in hospitals when sick. I started becoming suspicious. His instructions, which he termed as a message from God, were not to take our children to schools and instead to visit the church every day for life lessons. When I moved to the village from Malindi, I started a poultry farming business, but he was against it. He didn't want anyone to be involved in any economic activities or move from the village to the town centers. I became suspicious and quit the church, says Mr. Inongo. And from the sound of things, when Nthenge moved, his congregation came with him. And soon the town of Sokola was invaded by cultists, the newcomers quickly making themselves a problem for the longtime residents and local government officials alike. And I wish I had better sources on the subject, but I can imagine the cultists began preaching and trying to radicalize the young and vulnerable of the town. Now this no doubt incensed the locals, and violence between the two groups became much more likely. After all, how would you feel if a cult moved into your tiny town and began actively targeting your children? You know, just some food for thought. And then, because of COVID, everything went dark for a few years. He was now in full control, his people destitute and in need of his charity just to stay alive. It was probably everything Nthenge ever wanted out of life. He was now a king. But it wasn't enough, because it never is. No, despite having full control over his followers' minds, he wasn't satisfied. He wanted control over their lives in the most literal sense. Control over who lives and who dies. Now I believe with all my heart that Nthenge had gone full crazy by this point, the mad prophet finally succumbing to his own lies. And COVID did that with a lot of crazy people, unfortunately. It's like we have one weird year and all of a sudden every tinfoil hat and bus stop prophet thinks they've been vindicated. Ugh. It would seem that this one was no different, as he began to preach the apocalypse, telling his followers that this world was evil and full of pain, and that the only hope for comfort was death. But you know, only in the ways that he suggested, allegedly. Now you might ask yourself why his followers were so ready to die in the first place, but to me the answer seems pretty clear from their circumstances. Sources say that Nthenge had ordered his followers to renounce work and possessions. Not only that, but he moved them out to a rural area with very little in the way of supplies and opportunities. And so these poor, misguided people were forced to live in the bush, scavenging for what they could and taking handouts that Nthenge decided to give them. They were dirty, sick, tired, hungry, and exposed to the elements. And so given that, the pastor's calls for death and Armageddon actually sounded kind of nice. Like a release of sorts. March 22nd, 2023. Mr. Nthenge was arrested in connection to an unspeakable crime. Though he's yet to be convicted, it's thought that his teachings had turned into a death cult, with the rogue pastor allegedly ordering parents to kill their own children.
Yesterday, we went for an operation in Chakama after receiving information that there is a person who was radicalizing people, or rather brainwashing people, that they should starve their children to death, and so that they can see God in the future. The information we have is that some children had been starved to death, and they have been buried in shallow graves, and we have some evidence to that effect.
Police say Nthengay's rantings about the coming apocalypse drove suspects Isaac Ngala and Emily Kaunga to starve and smother 2 of their 3 children. That same Nation Africa article from before describes a grandfather's nightmare as he's told of what had happened. Francis Wanja knows too well the pain of his daughter and her husband thriving on the pastor's doomsday predictions. The 2 dead children are his grandchildren. He could not believe the news he received about his grandchildren being starved to death by their own parents. So on Wednesday, he embarked on a long journey from Mombasa to Shakola. His heart broke as he stood beside the shallow graves where his grandchildren are supposed to have been buried. As he mourned the loss of his grandchildren, Mr. Wanje was left with many questions. Could his own daughter and son-in-law do such a thing? And what role did the infamous Pastor Mackenzie play in this tragedy? Last Friday, I received a call from a stranger that my daughter had handcuffed her last-born on allegations of instructions from Pastor Mackenzie. Immediately, I sent someone to follow up on the matter, and I was shocked to learn that my daughter had starved to death 2 of her other children. One was buried the same week on Wednesday, and the other on Thursday. Mr. Wanje added, "Early last year, my daughter informed me that she was moving from Malindi town to Tanu River. All along, I knew she was in Tanu River County. Her husband had been in the GSU, General Service Unit, for 5 years, and my daughter was a social worker in Malindi. But the pastor's messages had convinced them to give up their livelihoods and devote themselves fully to his teachings." The children's parents had been followers of Pastor Mackenzie, who had reportedly instructed them to fast and attend his sermons. They were not allowed to have water or food as they supposedly awaited the return of Jesus. My heart broke into pieces as I thought of the pain and suffering my grandchildren must have endured before their untimely deaths, he said. The only solace he had was that his other grandson had been saved from the claws of death. The Saturday Nation found the boy all skin and bones, with a protruding belly and visible ribs, pointing to a case of severe malnutrition. Famished and weak, the boy could barely let out more than a muffled cry. As the article said, police believe that Nthengay had been encouraging parents among his followers to starve their children, denying them food and water, and instead encouraging them to bring these dying children to the church. Told to ignore their cries for food and agonized sobbing as hunger pangs ripped through them. That all of their suffering paled in comparison to what they would feel in the coming apocalypse. Better to have them die now, it was asserted. And unfortunately, it seems that his hold was strong enough to cause at least one pair of parents to obey him. The 2 accused, Isaac and Emily, are said to have bound their children to prevent them from escaping or finding food. And then, after several days or even weeks, they're said to have smothered 2 of their children on 2 separate occasions. It's asserted that Pastor Mackenzie not only knew about the murders, but actively encouraged the act. Some sources even accusing him of offering assistance after the fact on 2 separate occasions, reportedly directing the parents to a secluded spot where they could bury the 2 children unnoticed, not far from his own compound. And, sadly, this was only the beginning of the horrors, as for whatever reason, Nthengay was eventually given a pathetic 10,000 shilling or 700 USD bond and set loose awaiting trial, just as he had so many times before. And just as before, he would allegedly use his freedom to escalate his behavior, the man seemingly vindicated in his belief that he was above all earthly consequences. That same Nation Africa article also managed to get an interview with Nthengay himself, a reporter catching him as he walked the grounds of his abandoned church in Malindi on May 29th, 2023. By the way, outstanding work, you guys. Most articles were vague to the point of being useless, but you're a treasure. Never change. Yesterday, an unperturbed Mackenzie, who is under police investigation, said he believes that he has spiritual and prophetic powers, further claiming to have seen apparitions of Jesus. The father of 7 argued that this is the basic teachings of his brand of Christianity, but stated that he had stopped preaching in 2019. He says he is currently farming in Sokola village, where he bought land and occasionally visits. So, does he run a sect or a cult? I am shocked about the accusations placed before me. I closed my Good News International Church in Malindi in August of 2019, and it's important for people to accept that. I even sold the equipment there and the chairs as well. If a person used to worship with me, then they should do it on their own now, and not by my name. Follow Christ, not Pastor Mackenzie, he said in an interview. He went on, I have always been on the media for the wrong reasons. The media and individuals always misquote or decide to run a story out of context. The other time I made a sermon on earthly education being evil, and I was taken to court for telling children not to go to school. This was not the case. It was a prophecy, and it depends on how you take it. I can preach, but I do not force the teachings on anyone. Yesterday, Mackenzie granted the Sunday Nation a visit to his church where he used to preach. Enclosed in a perimeter wall, the pungent, fetid smell that engulfs the compound is the only giveaway that it's abandoned. I closed the church in 2019 because I got a revelation that the time to call it quits had come. I am not a pastor anymore. I identify as Mr. Mackenzie. I do not have a gathering to preach to, and I just pray with myself and those who choose to believe, he said as he shut the premises. And then, mere weeks later, news of starving and hollow-eyed cultists, emaciated and near death, began to filter out of Shikola village. When the police arrived on Tuesday, April 13th, most of the cultists had fled into the bush. They had no interest in being rescued from their salvation, and some were even prepared to fight officers if necessary. Well, Nathenge himself was quickly found and placed in temporary custody as teams fanned out over the property. And that's when they found the bodies. In a small clearing, police found 15 skeletal forms, 4 dead and the other 11 near enough to it. The victims were quickly ushered out of town by police-escorted ambulance all the way to Malindi, where they could receive the care they needed. Meanwhile, police had been informed of a mass grave containing at least 30 people on the property. But as they searched the bush, they noticed something terrifying. There were people, dozens of them standing off at range, some ducking behind trees while others boldly threatened officers. But regardless of their behavior or their demeanor, they all wanted the officers to know they were being watched. Well, authorities quickly realized that they were in unfamiliar wilderness surrounded by who knows how many hostile cultists. And so they were forced to retreat, intent on gathering more officers so they could safely excavate the reported mass graves without fear of attack. Quote, "The police were unable to conduct any further activity at the mass grave because of hostile residents in the forest believed to be the suspect's followers." But yeah, as of right now, that's where we stand. The police have yet to retake the Shikola forest, and even as I write, there's still suspected to be up to dozens of cultists in the bush, some starving and others dead. It's unclear how many more will be saved and how many have already died, but the situation remains unresolved. Well, while I was editing this video, things just kept getting crazier, so here's what I've learned since Monday the 17th. Here's a snippet from an article entitled "Controversial Pastor Mackenzie Detained for 14 Days Over Followers' Deaths" by John Wanjoy. Controversial pastor Paul Nathenge Mackenzie of the Good News International Church will spend 14 more days in police custody pending investigations into the deaths of his followers. Mackenzie, who is accused of influencing his followers to fast to death, appeared before Malindi Chief Magistrate Elizabeth Ushi on Tuesday, but was not required to plead to any charge. The prosecution sought to have the preacher detained for 30 more days, but the magistrate ordered he be held in police custody for 14 days alongside 6 of his followers. 7 other followers, whom the prosecution described as victims as they refused to eat even while they were in police custody, will be held for 7 days for counseling. The magistrate also canceled a 10,000 shilling bond granted to Mackenzie in an earlier case where he is accused of influencing 2 minors to fast to death. Magistrate Usi says the fact that one of the preacher's victims requests to be released and to go on to continue with his prayers and fasting in Shikola was evidence enough that such activities were still ongoing in the area and that releasing the suspect could lead to witness interference.
Mackenzie has been arraigned at the Malindi law courts and his initial 10,000 shillings bond cancelled, allowing the prosecution's plea to have him detained for 14 days, while his 14 accomplices will be guests of the state for 7 days. The court also allowed the exhumation of 14 bodies, which are said to be of Mackenzie's followers. Alan Ochanda, KTN News.
And so yeah, as of Tuesday, April 18th, 2023, police are reported to have found the mass grave on Nathenge's property, but have kept details close to the chest for now. And as for the rest of Nathenge's followers, well, yesterday 7 more were reported to have been taken from the Shikola wood alive. But there is still thought to be up to dozens of people still hiding in the bush, their fates still unknown. Well, what happens next, I really can't say, as I know next to nothing about the Kenyan legal system. I know, shocker. I mean, given my obvious mastery of the local language, you'd think I'd be an expert. No, but on a serious note, we've seen Nthenge make a habit of being charged with crimes only to be let go with what I consider to be a slap on the wrist. But to say more I think would be irresponsible, as the investigation is still ongoing and no new charges have yet to be filed. I'll be sure to do a follow-up once things develop further, and let's hope by then Nthenge has been convicted and placed in a cage for the rest of his natural-born life. As always, though, if you like what you heard, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I know this one was a little different than most of my other videos, but I really couldn't resist a good true story, recent or otherwise. After all, I mean, most of what I talk about was current events at one point, even if it was 500 years ago. Until next time, this has been another Story Time, and I've been your host, Andrew Jackson, wishing you safe travels and dry socks.